We begin tonight on the tarmac in Washington, D.C. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett boarding his flight back to Israel following his first official meeting as Prime Minister with President Joe Biden. And Bennett describing the weekend talks as warm and effective.
בין הנשיא ביידן לביני נוצר קשר ישיר ואישי, קשר שמושתת על אמון. אנחנו השגנו את כל המטרות שהצבנו לביקור ואף מעבר לכך. סיכמנו עם האמריקאים על עבודה אסטרטגית משותפת לבלימת המרוץ האיראני לגרעין. אנחנו עשינו צעד משמעותי בהצטיידות ובבניין הכוח הישראלי.
But while Bennett leaving the States with a feeling of accomplishment, Iranian leadership stepping further and further away from a negotiated settlement. Ayatollah Khamenei saying that, at least from his perspective, Presidents Biden and Trump are two sides of the same coin.
هم هیچ فرقی با دولت قبلی نداره. یعنی همین چیزی که الان اینا در زمینه مسائل هسته‌ای مطالبه میکنن از ایران همون چیزی است که ترامپ مطالبه میکرد که اون روز مسئولین بالای دولتی میگفتن که امکان نداره، عاقلانه نیست و فلان. امروز اینا همون رو میخوان، هیچ تفاوتی نکرد. او با یه زبان میگفت، اینا با یه زبان دیگه.
Now joining me to discuss is columnist from Newsweek and editor of HistoryCentral.com, Mark Schulman, and Professor Mark Meirowitz from the New York Maritime College at SUNY. Thank you both so much for being with us. Now, I'm going to start with you, Mark Schulman. Let's start with Israel-U.S. relations. Bennett famously stating that he wanted to reset Israeli ties with the United States. But do you think that this has happened?
Up to an extent, absolutely. I mean, just the fact that it wasn't Prime Minister Netanyahu, or that former Prime Minister Netanyahu, that was enough to reset things. Obviously, Netanyahu's relationship with the Democratic Party was very problematic. And just by the fact that it was somebody else, that was a reset in and of itself. Obviously, Bennett's English is just as good as Netanyahu, so he was a good face for America. So to that extent, he certainly has reset it. He's also developed a dialogue directly with President Biden, which is always important to have that personal connection. So in the general sense, he's reset it. I mean, what does that mean in terms of actual policy? It means a little bit. It could mean a lot in time of crisis. We'll have to see how that develops.
So, Professor Meirowitz, I want to turn to you as well now with a follow-up on this, because Washington Post columnist Henry Olsen writes that no matter what, the United States-Israel relationship will likely sour under Biden and Bennett due to their diametrically opposing viewpoints. How do you respond?
It's the Washington Post. My point being that I would say that it's a pause button. What is that? I looked in the newspapers today to see news on Israel, particularly Israel strikes in Gaza, and there's nothing. All the news is Hurricane Ida and also Afghanistan. So in a way, there was good news and bad news. The good news was, in a sense, it's not good really, that there were these tragedies in Afghanistan for Israel, and then this was the focus. If you saw Biden, he was very subdued. It was a very good meeting, very good optics. So I think that it is unclear whether there's going to be a reset, because I don't know if America has enough political capital or Biden has enough political juice to do resets on this. I think they worked up some good interim agreements. Biden didn't mention the Abraham Accords, but talked about Israel's relations with the Muslim states. They didn't pursue very much on the Palestinian issue. And on Iran, Prime Minister Bennett got his points across. To me, the future is uncertain after Afghanistan. We don't know what's going to happen in China with Taiwan, in Iran with nuclear. These are the great questions. But Israel got a lot of good things out of this, and that was the fact that the Iron Dome is going to be funded. Israeli strength is, and the connection between Israel and the United States, Biden said it a number of times, is absolutely rock solid. So I think if I were Bennett, I would be, cautiously optimistic, but concerned about the state of the world and American foreign policy going forward, and the extent to which America will be able to focus its attention on, obviously, what's coming in Iran in particular on that issue.
All right, back to you, Mark Schulman. Moving on to Bennett and Biden's new approach to Iran. Bennett is saying that the approach has two main goals. The first, to stop and roll back Iran's regional aggressions, and the second, to permanently keep Iran from nuclear weapons. Biden, in the meantime, is telling Bennett that while preferred, if diplomacy fails, we've got other options. How much time is left to close a deal before Iran's breakout? How close to these other options are we?
Okay, how close to the breakout is not at all clear. Defense Minister Gantz talked about 2 months to have the material to make a bomb, but then between having the material to making a bomb and actually having a bomb, there could be 1 or 2 years beyond that. So we don't really know what their intentions are. So that's number one. It's hard to make that assumption. Look, the fact that the United States left JCPOA was a disaster because there was no follow-up. There was no plan B in case Iran didn't fold, and Iran didn't fold. And so we're stuck in the situation where Iran has made a lot of progress since the U.S. pulled out of JCPOA. Israel has delayed it by various means. How much cooperation they're getting from the United States until now is unclear. I'm sure they'll be getting more cooperation going forward as it becomes clear that I don't think the Iranians want a deal in the end. Look, we have to go all the way back in history, all the way back. 2016, why did Obama rush to make a deal? He rushed to make a deal because some of the sanctions were running out, and the Chinese and Russians said they were not going to sign on to extend them. So we needed a deal. Right now, the Chinese and Russians are working closely with the Iranians. So whatever leverage the United States has is limited because it does not have the support of the Russians and the Chinese. So we need to understand that. It's up to Israel to find ways of delaying the Iranians as much as possible. With American help, that would be great. I don't expect a direct Israeli attack on the Iranians because that's very, very problematic. But I think Israel will get support from the United States for whatever covert action it takes. Now, Biden would prefer an agreement. But, Biden's only one side of the negotiations, and the Iranians, I don't think, want the agreement in any case. So we'll have to see where that goes.
So, Professor Meyerowitz, what do you suspect these other options include? We've heard talk of maybe allowing Israel to continue, sort of covert actions against Iran's nuclear development, but it's doubtful that the United States, for example, would deploy any ground forces to fight Iran. And Bennett also said that he would never ask the United States to outsource forces. So again, could you maybe go into what the other options might look like?
Well, I wouldn't really know what they are because they're all secret. But let me say from the geopolitical point of view that I can do some forecasting. First of all, Iran is also distracted in Afghanistan. So is Russia and China. The whole region has been upended by Afghanistan. You really have to look at this, and that will influence the United States thinking on this. So the question is, if Israel takes an action, will the United States react, and what way will they react? Now, if you look at the JCPOA, as my distinguished colleague has pointed out, historically it was a failure. Now, notwithstanding that, the United States has pursued this agreement so far as sitting in another hotel and letting the group sit with Iran and let China be the interlocutor and come tell you at the hotel what they discussed is a shame and humiliation for a world power like the United States to have to negotiate like this. And frankly, you heard the Ayatollah. Listen carefully, Mr. Biden, the Ayatollah. He says, Biden, Trump, you're all the same, and I don't want to deal with you, and I'm the boss, and so they don't want to make a deal. So question is, what does the United States do? Ground forces? That's out of the question. You look again at Afghanistan. Letting Israel have leeway on these issues? I would surmise, I haven't the slightest idea, I don't know, but I'm surmise that Israel is going to take action as it has in the past in concert with the United States, certainly on the covert side. So there'll be more leeway for Israel. I think that we saw that in the meeting between Bennett and Biden, a very cordial meeting, but also very, very, open in terms of what Bennett was saying. I don't think Biden contradicted him at all. So I think that the optics were good on this issue. Israel will have, I believe, much more leeway because the United States is distracted. And as I would argue, Iran, Russia, China, they're all distracted by what's going on in Afghanistan. That collapse is not just for American foreign policy, but it will impact Iran. The Shiites in Afghanistan are being massacred by the Taliban. There's just the whole region is in a complete turmoil. So at the end of the day, I'm going to be cautiously optimistic that Israel will be able to take the necessary action, and maybe Iran will be cautious in terms of what it's going to do going forward in light of all of the confusion that is engendered here in Afghanistan.
All right, Professor Mark Meirowitz, Mark Schulman, thank you both so much for speaking with us today.
Pleasure.
Now, meantime, as Prime Minister Bennett gets ready to return to Israel from D.C., Israeli Defense Forces fighting off an incursion from the Gaza Strip.
במהלך הלילה צה"ל תקף בעזה בתגובה על הפרחת הבלונים. כמו שאני כבר אמרתי, אנחנו נפעל בעזה לפי האינטרס שלנו. ומבחינתי, הכתובת בעזה הייתה ונשארה חמאס.
Israeli fighter jets hitting 2 Hamas-affiliated sites in the Gaza Strip Sunday morning, including a military weapons manufacturing plant and training facility and the entrance to a cross-border terror tunnel. And this after Palestinians from the Strip resumed their intensive violence along the security fence over the weekend, complete with incendiary balloons and nighttime harassment operations. Operations which, despite their title, are among the most violent Hamas-run programs, with operatives often throwing explosives and shooting towards Israeli soldiers in nearby communities. Hamas saying their intentions are to pressure Israel into lifting the blockade, which both Israel and Egypt have maintained since Hamas's violent takeover in 2007. That said, Hamas actually is increasing its violence in recent weeks, despite Israel acquiescing to most of the terror group's demands in efforts to finalize a ceasefire agreement. In fact, Israel has reopened border crossings, is increasing the number of employment permits for Gazans who want to work in Israel, is allowing the resumption of Qatari aid, and more. And Jerusalem, for its part, is just calling for the return of the remains of 2 dead soldiers and for the freedom of 2 more Israeli civilians thought captive in Gaza for 6 years. Shifting again now, we head towards Afghanistan, where tens of thousands of people are still desperately trying to escape from the Taliban and other Islamic terrorists. But between suicide bombings at Kabul airport, limited resources, and the rapidly approaching deadline for evacuation, there's a lot of work left to be done. So luckily, several humanitarian groups are trying to pick up the slack, one of which is the Shai Fund, a humanitarian NGO based in Israel working to coordinate the evacuation efforts. Joining me with the details is Director of the Shai Fund, Charmaine Heading. Charmaine, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, so what exactly has the Shai Fund been doing with respect to the Afghanistan evacuations?
Well, we realized immediately that due to the colossal magnitude of the humanitarian crisis that was happening there, that there would be many people, religious minorities, women at risk, people like that who would be left behind. And that's aside from the huge number of people that worked for the US government and were contracted for them and other international NGOs that are also now in mortal danger. So we've been trying to assist with a private humanitarian initiative with a group of NGOs to try and help these people to be able to evacuate. And we're working in collaboration with Mercury One or the Nazarene Fund, who are providing the planes, and we're supplying all the grassroots names and numbers of people that need to be urgently evacuated to try and get them to the airport and save as many souls as we can.
Now, I understand that your first escape flight, actually your first evacuation flight of about 300 or so people is supposed to arrive tonight. What are the primary challenges that you've been facing in these rescue efforts?
Actually, we've had 7 flights to date that we've had people come on from the airport in Kabul. I think it's one of the biggest private initiatives that there's been, and it's all been funded by people who care around the globe and realize that these people that we're trying to assist, if we don't help them, the Taliban are going to take them and they are going to end up dead. We know even now that people are being sought after and the Taliban is hunting them down from door to door. We're talking about women's rights activists. We're talking about religious converts. We're talking about people in these kinds of categories that are being in safe houses, but are in real big danger now because they represent everything that the Taliban hates. They represent everything we in the West love. And
so, I mean, can you speak a little bit more about the coordination efforts and how this came about? How you're coordinating with people on the ground as well. Do you have really just one or two people on the ground who are your eyes and ears, or do you have maybe a little bit better of a network? Are you speaking with individual refugees?
Yes, we have a significant network because we've been working in this kind of field in the Middle East and Africa for many years now. And so it was easy for us to activate the network. And as soon as we realized that we could form a coalition of like-minded NGOs that would be able to work together and push it forward to land the flights on the ground, we moved immediately, and we were one of the first to get it together and get on the ground, start collecting the names and the people at risk and collecting the information that we needed in order to move them out the country. And that's primarily what we've done, just because of our experience with this, and also because of the networks. It's these kinds of networks who work on human rights issues, on democracy and civil society, on these kinds of issues. We know them and we understand them. It's the kind of work that we do. It's our bread and butter.
And I've myself have been speaking to a lot of people who our heart breaks for what's happening right now in Afghanistan, but we feel helpless. What can we do from home? How can we get involved with NGOs like yours, or even some of the others that you're affiliated with?
Yeah, I mean, we're working together, and it's been incredible to see how the humanitarian sector has come together on this, and we're very proud that we've been able to coordinate. But anyone who wants to give can give. It's the name of the website that you can give at is www.theshyfund.org. So www.theshyfund.org.
All right. Charmaine Heading, thank you so much for joining us and for everything that you're doing in Afghanistan, and good luck.
Thank you.
Moving on, good news and bad news on the coronavirus front in Israel. The good news is that the positivity rate seems to be waning again just shortly after surpassing 7%. And this as the effect of third-dose booster vaccines are seemingly starting to truly kick in. But the bad news is that the hard-fought gains may be reversing, and soon. The school year, for one, is slated to begin on Wednesday, with Health Ministry Director General Nachman Ash saying that he believes that no more lockdowns are on the way and that students in Israel will study in person for more days than they did last year. Yet over 3,000 students just tested positive for COVID over the weekend, and over 130,000 more students and school staff are currently in quarantine. Meantime, whether under lockdown or not, make sure to keep your masks on and stay away from crowds during the coming high holiday season, because while the Delta variant appears to be under control, several new variants are raising concerns, particularly the C.1.2 variant, which was first detected in South Africa but has since spread to England, Europe, China, parts of Africa, Mauritius, and New Zealand. Scientists believe the new variant to be substantially mutated from its predecessor, with an evolution rate of about 42 mutations per year. That's nearly double the rate of any other strain. And researchers are still trying to figure out, however, what the impacts of these mutations are, as well as whether or not C.1.2 has a competitive advantage over the currently more dominant Delta variant. In other news, we head back in time now to Lithuania of old. Excavation teams uncovering incredible artifacts from the Great Synagogue of Vilna. And for the first time since the synagogue was destroyed by both the Nazis and the Soviets over 60 years ago.
היה לו רצפה כוכב שעמד במרכז בית הכנסת לפני ארון הקודש. כאשר אנחנו עוברים לצד, אנחנו רואים את המדרגות שעלו לארון הקודש, מדרגות שנהרסו כאמור על ידי הנאצים והסובייטים.
The Israeli-Lithuanian excavation expedition, waking the world over the weekend with new evidence of the centuries-old Jewish life from Vilna, Lithuania. And the excavations focused on none other than the Great Synagogue complex of Vilna, also known as the Shulhoif, which at one point boasted 12 synagogues and prayer halls, a community council building, kosher meat stalls, a seminary, a very famous library, and more. Nearly all of it destroyed, though, looted and burned by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And then in 1956-57, the Soviets demolished what remained, making way for a modern school that's since been built on the campus. Still, history finding a way to reveal itself. Archaeologists now exposing remnants of the Aron HaKodesh, or the Torah Ark, and the Bima, or the altar from the Great Synagogue of Vilna, for the first time since the Holocaust. And that's not all. Most recently, a silver yad, or hand-shaped pointer used to read from the Torah, was found over the weekend. Also, 2 impressive staircases seen in images of the synagogue from before its destruction were discovered. The entire facade of the altar has been completely excavated, and one of the 4 massive pillars that supported the roof has been exposed.
כאן בבית הכנסת אנחנו רואים את העמוד הגדול, שאחד מ4 עמודים שעמדו בבית הכנסת. אנחנו עוברים כאן במבט אל הבימה, הבימה הגדולה שנבנתה על ידי היסוד במאה ה-17, ומתחת לבימת בית הכנסת מרתף גדול שהיה שייך ככל נראה לבית כנסת המקורי, שנבנה כאן עוד במאה ה-16 או תחילת ה-17. בתוכו מצאנו לפני שנה כתובת מרהיבה שמסבירה איך היהודים מווילנה עלו ארצה לארץ ישראל כחלק מהעלייה של היישוב הישן.
The Great Synagogue of Vilna was built in the 17th century in the Renaissance Baroque style, and it stood for roughly 350 years before its erasure. And now we head back to Japan for the latest from Israel's Paralympic delegation in Tokyo. The team finishing up an amazing weekend with several more medals and world records to their names. Starting with Mark Malyar, the Israeli swimmer scoring 2 gold medals and breaking 2 world records for Paralympic swimming in the process, one of which was his own world record set in London in 2019. But Malyar is placing first this year with 4 minutes and 36.06 seconds in the 400-meter freestyle, and then with 2 minutes, 29.01 seconds in the 200-meter individual medley. Then with 3 more events ahead of him, Malyar's winning streak in Japan may not even be over. But in any case, Malyar's medals making for the 4th and 5th Israeli medals at this year's Paralympics so far for Israel. A great way to keep the momentum going after Iyad Shalabi's first place finish on the first day of this year's competition. And as for the remaining medalists, Israeli swimmer Ami Omer Dadaon winning silver in the 150-meter individual medley, finishing the race in 2 minutes and 29.48 seconds on Saturday, and then rower Moran Samuel similarly taking silver on Sunday morning in the women's 2,000-meter single sculls. Samuel passing the finish line with 11 minutes and 18.39 seconds. Congratulations all, and good luck to the future competitors. Now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Chana Rifkin.
Well, another week of mostly sunshine. Meteorologists calling for very cloudy weather in a lot, with warm lows countrywide between 19 to 27 degrees Celsius. And then tomorrow's high temperatures expected to be between 28 to 39 degrees Celsius, depending on where you are in Israel. Now back to the studio with Aaron.
And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Ooh. Looks like somebody's getting pulled over by the IDF for a stop and search. Or is it? Wow, she must be freaking out. I wonder how you would arrange something like this. You just call your local IDF unit and say, hey, I'm trying to propose to my girlfriend. Could you harass us? Congratulations to them, though. That's amazing. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.22 shekels to the American dollar and 2.55 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well. Thank you so much for watching.